She was 7, barefoot on cold pavement, sweeping until the clock said 10, because someone had told her she could not go inside before then. A thin broom scraped rhythm into the frost of a November morning in an upscale São Paulo street. Behind the iron gate, the mansion's marble steps stayed immaculate. At the threshold stood Patrícia Almeida, immaculate in a crisp coat, and the faint ghost of expensive perfume hovering in the air, watching the child as if she were an errand to be checked off. A man's black SUV cruised past on the avenue. The driver's face was distant. The man inside, still somewhere in the world of boardrooms and flights. That man was Rodrigo Almeida, a billionaire whose name opened doors and closed questions. The girl on the pavement, however, was not a stranger to those doors. Sofia Almeida was his adopted daughter. The image arrested Marina Ferreira the way a stone can arrest a skipping pebble. It was half an hour before classes started when Marina, the school's pedagogical coordinator, was walking the route she took every morning between the staff parking and the building. She had seen many students arrive in many ways, a mother carrying a breakfast box, a teenager with earbuds, a father waving from a distance. She had not expected to find a small child bent over a broom outside a mansion, cold fingertips whitening around a stick. Something in Marina's chest tightened in a way that did not belong to the simple surprise of an oddity. It felt like recognition. She had worked long enough with children to know the look of a child asked to shrink herself to fit an adult's order. Marina stopped. She watched until she could name the specifics. The girl's dress was thin for the season, the hem frayed at the knees. Her feet were small, and the soles grey with street dust. Her shoulders rose and fell in a way that suggested she was trying to make herself small to contain a worry. Patrícia did not move. The woman's posture had the practiced poise of someone who had learned to show calm in public and command in private. When Marina finally approached, the woman's smile was polished, the kind offered to polite neighbors and school staff, not to one's own child. "Good morning," Marina said, keeping her voice even. "She's a student here, Sofia, right?" Patrícia nodded. The smile was without warmth. "Yes, she helps around the house. It's good for her to learn responsibility." Her tone was final, the kind that turns questions into inconveniences. She spoke as if explaining a household policy, not answering a worry. Sofia looked up then, for an instant, and her eyes met Marina's. There was a flash of something behind them. Fear, perhaps, or merely the exhaustion of carrying a secret that could not be named. Her lips formed a small line. She did not speak. She did not ask to go inside. Marina did not linger on the pavement. She did not raise her voice. She walked to the school, leaving the child and the gate behind, but the image lodged in her mind like a splinter. In the classroom where Sofia sat, Marina had seen other signs over the weeks. Withdrawn answers, lunches left almost untouched, drawings that included small, repeated phrases. There had been a downward pattern that felt like a map. Attendance slipping, grades falling, a child who had once been bright and talkative becoming an outline of herself. At her desk, Marina opened Sofia's file. The school's records were precise, as they must be. The attendance log, the teacher's notes, the copies of homework turned in late or not at all. The pedagogical reports were clinical in tone, but their accumulation produced a different effect. Sofia's grades had dropped steadily over the last semester. Excused absences had increased. A line at the end of a teacher's note caught Marina's eye. Not long, but enough. A child had turned in a drawing during art class with a sentence written in jagged letters. "I'm scared." Marina kept that sentence in her head like a pulse. She reread the submitted drawing. The watercolor showed a small figure standing alone by a large house with tall gates. The little figure's mouth was a thin slash. Next to it, as if written by a small, urgent hand, 3 words, "I'm scared." The drawing was dated and signed with Sofia's name. It was filed in the pedagogical records, and it would later be referenced in official reports. For now, it was Marina's anchor to what she had seen outside the gate. She spoke with Sofia's teacher that afternoon. The teacher confirmed the changes. Sofia had been quiet for months, sometimes skipping lunch, sometimes isolating herself, sometimes arriving to school with bruises the child described away as accidents. No one person's notes, the teacher said, but a pattern. The school had not ignored these small things. There had been informal conversations, an attempt at interviews with the family. Each effort had been greeted with a rehearsed calm and a refusal. Sofia was sensitive. Sofia needed discipline. The professionals at the school did what they could within the constraints of parental rights, but a child's welfare sometimes required action beyond a teacher's reach. Marina did not wait to build the perfect file. She called Council Tutelar, the Municipal Child Protection Agency, and asked for guidance. The voice at the other end of the line was procedural, the kind used to triage worries from threats. Marina explained what she had seen, the child sweeping, the drawing, the pattern in school. She offered to bring copies of the records, and she requested that an officer visit the family. The official at Council Tutelar who took the call, Carla Mendez, listened. When Marina described the sweeping, the cold pavement, the stepmother framed by the gate, Carla registered the detail and asked the kind of questions that make a case concrete. Dates, who had seen what, whether the child had spoken about her home. Marina provided specifics. The agency put a preliminary report into the system and scheduled a home visit. It was an action that carried weight. A visit by Council Tutelar meant a formal entry into the family's life, a step toward assessment, and if needed, protection. The next day, Marina went to school early with a small stack of photocopies. The attendance logs, the teacher's annotations, the drawing labeled "I'm scared." She was careful to keep the child's dignity at the center of everything she prepared. "We must protect her privacy," she told the administrative assistant. "We will file a report. We will not display this to anyone who doesn't have the right to see it." The school sent someone with Marina to meet the Council Tutelar officer at the family's mansion the day the visit was scheduled. Carla arrived in a plain jacket, carrying the kind of professional presence that is practiced rather than performative. She had handled similar calls before. Her expression was steady. They walked through the gate together, past manicured hedges and polished stone. The house was big enough to swallow ordinary sounds. The butler opened the door and announced them. Inside, a quiet ordered the rooms, an interior designed to show that everything that happened there was controlled. They were shown into a sitting room where Patrícia stood, polite, the same smile Marina had seen at the gate. Her hands were gloved, her nails were manicured, her voice was calm. When asked if Sofia was at home, she said that she was not, or that she had been out with a tutor. Answers came in rehearsed patterns. The council workers' questions reached for detail, for the child's routine, for the adults responsible for her care when the father traveled. Rodrigo's name appeared in the conversation in a way that had weight without presence. He was often away, they said. His work took him abroad. The home's smooth fabric revealed tiny snags. Patrícia received the official visit with the kind of composure one learns when one is practiced at being judged. "We cooperate," she said. "We care for Sofia. She's an intelligent, sensitive child. We are strict because she needs structure." The words were put forward like shields. No outright refusal, no aggression, but also no invitation to examine what happened behind the closed doors. The housekeeper, present in the background, kept her head down. After the visit, Marina left with a formal acceptance of the report filed. The council officer advised the school to document everything and to be ready to provide any additional material. It was the beginning of a process. It was not the end. Word of the complaint traveled in small waves that ripple under the surface of wealthy circles. Within days, the family took steps that suggested they wanted to tighten their circle. Sofia's presence at school became more erratic. Notes arrived claiming there had been a scheduling change. An unmarked driver appeared at the school to collect the child. Officially, Patrícia said Sofia needed rest. Unofficially, the message was clear. Scrutiny was unwelcome. Marina watched as the little figure who had been the subject of a dozen small classroom confidences was pulled away, physically and socially. The next pivot came from an unexpected place. Weeks into the bureaucratic cadence of calls and meetings, Marina received a phone call from a woman whose voice trembled but whose words were sure. Donna Marta, a former housekeeper at the mansion, said she had information. Marta had left the household months earlier. She had kept nothing by way of objects. She had kept, however, a photograph and a memory. When they met, Marta's hands were the hands of someone who had spent decades preparing meals, folding linens, polishing silver. She spoke low, with a caution that suggested she suspected repercussions for speaking. Her eyes flicked to the corner where Marina had placed the school's records. She reached into her bag and produced a single photo folded carefully in a plastic sleeve. The image showed Sofia on the same pavement Marina had found her on, small broom in hand, looking down as if counting some invisible measure. The photograph was dated and showed a timestamp in the corner. It was taken during the very period when school records showed an uptick in absences and a downward slide in grades. Donna Marta's account added context to the picture. She described days when the child arrived home hungry and noticed small, consistent patterns. Doors closed during mealtimes, instructions barked at odd hours, a tone in the household that did not sit with the idea of nurture. Her testimony was not theatrical. It was ordinary and therefore chilling in its steadiness. She talked to herself sometimes, Marta said, choosing words with the caution of a witness who had thought for years about what to say and how to say it. She would whisper and fold her arms. I would watch and wonder. She gave Marina the photograph and consented to have the image recorded as part of the school's documentation and as a lead for council tutelers investigators. For the first time, Marina felt the fragments, the drawing, the broom, the absences, lock into a clearer shape. It was not proof of criminality, it was evidence of pattern. In such cases, pattern was the heart of action. When school records, eyewitness testimony, and a photograph converge, the likelihood that a child is in a harmful situation increases enough to merit intervention. Marina knew how these pieces read to a judge, to a social worker, to a forensic examiner. They told a story that spoke louder than a single moment. News of the developing case did not stay confined to the offices and the investigators. In a city of hyper-connected circles, whispers leak. A neighbor's curiosity became an email to a journalist, and in the newsroom of a mid-sized paper, the story caught the attention of Leonardo Costa, an investigative reporter who often followed stories that touched on power imbalances and children's welfare. He called Marina, not because he hunted scandal, but because he was interested in how institutions responded when the wealthy were involved. When the powerful are involved, he said on the phone, the usual routes can get complicated. I want to be present to see the official records. Marina was cautious. She knew the benefits and risks of media presence. A journalist could amplify a child's voice, but a headline could also provoke retaliation. Before any public statements were made, the family made a defensive maneuver. Patrícia's social circles assembled their own version of events. A terse note surfaced from a lawyer with the family's initials, framed as a defense of reputation and as a warning to those who might jump to conclusions. The strategy was familiar: question the motives of the accuser, minimize the documentation, present the appearance of cooperation while tightening the net. The message was clear enough to make even Marina feel the first prickle of caution. When a powerful household mobilizes reputation management, the costs fall on those who have less power to respond. Few things in Marina's career had prepared her for the precise fear that comes when the adults with more resources decide a child's schooling will no longer be tolerated in the same building. A driver came for Sofia one Tuesday afternoon. The office called the family to confirm pickup authorization. Clerical notes recorded the driver's name, the license plate, the time. Sofia walked out of the classroom with her backpack heavy on her small shoulders, put one foot into the driver's car, and disappeared down the avenue. The bell rang and class went on. The ritual of education resumed, but a quiet that felt like a held breath lingered in Marina's chest. She called council tutelar. She called the school's director. She made the note in the file, each action registered like a pebble impacting a still pond. There were protocols to follow: document, record, notify. Marina knew that if intervention was to succeed, it would need clarity and patience. It would need corroborating voices. It would need to build a case in a way that could withstand the pressure of wealth and influence. In the days that followed, the school compiled its packet: the attendance logs, teacher statements, the drawing bearing the three-word message, "I'm scared," and the photograph provided by Donna Marta. It was a dossier of small, accumulated facts. The pedagogical coordinator filed these materials with council tutelar and with a lawyer, Dr. Enrique Tavares, who had agreed to take an initial consult pro bono after a colleague recommended him. Enrique read the documents with the kind of attention he gave to cases that had both legal and moral urgency. He nodded at the photograph. He noted the pattern. He explained, in plain terms, what the next steps could be: a welfare evaluation, a medical exam if necessary, a temporary protective measure if danger was imminent. At the center of the case remained a child whose daily life was now governed by grown-ups negotiating thresholds. What constitutes harm? What can be proven? What must be protected? Marina felt the weight of decision in a new way. Children depended on the adults who recognized risk to act, and when those adults did act, the consequences could be swift and fraught. Action could mean safety, but it could also spur countermoves from those with resources to litigate reputations and restrict access. Rodrigo Almeida remained an absent orbit. When Marina finally reached his assistant's office, the replies were polite and distant. He was often traveling. He cared deeply for his family. He trusted those who managed his home. When Marina persisted, an assistant agreed to pass on a message. That was all. In a case where the father's physical distance complicated immediate decision-making, the adults closest to the child, the school, the social worker, the ex-employee with a photograph, became the de facto protectors. None of them wanted to be tokens in a battle. They wanted a child safe. Back at the school, the staff held an internal meeting about how to handle the situation. The director instructed teachers to keep all records meticulous and to refrain from speaking to the press without authorization. The conversation was practical because its stakes were practical. If the child was in danger, action had to be documented. If the family responded with legal threats, the school had to be prepared to show what it had seen. Marina moved through the days with a new vigilance. She took her lunch at a desk and reviewed records. She called council tutelar for updates. She spoke to Sofia's classmates' parents without revealing private details, gently asking if anyone had noticed signs. She listened. Children are porous to other children's pain in ways adults sometimes fail to see, and small stories began to form. A classmate remembered Sofia saying she missed her old school. Another whispered that Sofia once sat alone at recess. None of the anecdotes were explosive on their own, but they stitched into the fabric of the case. Then came the call that made everything feel more urgent. A teacher had found another drawing in the trash can behind the art room. It was folded and smudged, abandoned as if the child had tried to erase it. The drawing, when unfolded, showed the same small figure near a gate and a large house. This time, beneath the figure, the child had written, "He comes later." That line changed the tenor of everything. "He comes later" implied a schedule, an order. It hinted at the presence of someone who arrived and whose arrival mattered. A parent, perhaps, who returned home and whose presence brought a shift in routine. Marina thought of the morning with the broom, of the instruction to finish before 10, and her chest tightened again. The house was not merely a place with rules, it was a place with timing and an adult presence that regulated the child's day according to unseen standards. Marina had to act with greater speed. She arranged a meeting with the council officer, Carla, and with Dr. Henrique. The three sat in the school's empty conference room and pieced together the packets of evidence. They labeled documents, time-stamped photos, attached teacher reports, and catalogued the drawings. As they worked, Marina's phone buzzed with a text from Leonardo Costa. "If you want, I can meet with you and see the documents. There may be a public interest component here." And Marina hesitated. Exposure could help protect the child by shining light, but it could also complicate a delicate legal strategy. The decision to involve the press is never simple, especially in cases involving children. Marina thought about Sofia's small hands on the broom and the guarded way she had looked at her. She thought about the photograph that had made the broom and the cold visible to those who might not otherwise look. She thought about the drawing. "I'm scared. He comes later." She folded her hands over the stack of papers on the table and made a choice. She would invite Leonardo to document and to hold the story in public awareness, but only under conditions that preserved the child's identity and dignity. The child's face would not be shown. The child's name would be used only when necessary and with protection. Any recording would be vetted by the legal counsel. "Light can be protection," Leonardo said when they met. "It can also complicate legal proceedings, but if coordinated, it can push institutions to act." He spoke like someone who had seen how pressure often moved slowness to action. Within a week, Council Tutelar scheduled a medical evaluation. It was the kind of clinical assessment done when a child's physical well-being might be compromised. Weight checks, notes on signs of neglect, a search for indicators that required formal documentation. The school prepared to accompany Sofia to the exam and to provide the records as supporting evidence. Marina thought of the child's small feet on the pavement and hoped that the medical team would see what the school saw. And then there was the moment that made protection feel immediate, an official order for an interim welfare check. Council Tutelar moved to visit the home again with a more formal mandate. When they arrived, the mansion was tidier than before. Curtains were drawn in places they had once been open. The butler answered the door with the same quietness as before, but this time the officials were escorted into rooms to look at the child's sleeping arrangements, the food in the pantry, the overall conditions of care. Agents asked to speak privately with household staff. A pattern of reticence emerged. Some employees answered questions, others hesitated. Fear of losing employment and retaliation had sealed many mouths. Donna Marta, who had already spoken to Marina, found herself approached by investigators who treated her testimony as a piece of a growing mosaic. She repeated what she had told Marina: small, ordinary facts, the times when meals were controlled, the occasions when a child was ordered to remain outside until an adult declared otherwise. She consented to hand over the photograph and to make a formal statement. For the first time, the photograph left her bag and entered an official file. The idea of evidence in this case was not a single damning photograph, but a lattice of small items: the drawings, the attendance logs, the witness statements, the medical notes that might come. The file was growing into something that could be presented, if necessary, in a courtroom. Not as tabloid-esque accusation, but as documented concern from multiple reliable sources. At home, behind the mansion's polished door, Patricia's response changed tone. She began to speak more pointedly to the staff about loyalty. She made small comments when passing the gate, comments intended to deflate inquiries from neighbors. She raised her voice once, in a way that one of the house's remaining staff later described as sharp and warning. For Marina, those small changes read like pressure. The employer's distance, Rodrigo's travel schedule, complicated the timeline for permanent decisions. A father's physical presence often changed the plan for immediate protective measures. When he was away, the child's advocates had to rely on the institutionality of social work and the courts. Marina kept piling documents into boxes, labeled with dates and times. The school held its breath in procedural patience. As the dossier solidified, the family's legal counsel reached out to the school with the kind of formal letter that telegraphed a defensive posture. They disputed insinuations, requested records be kept confidential, and warned against publication. Patricia's lawyer voiced a concern about reputational damage. The letter arrived in the school's inbox and was logged, because in the world where money could retain counsel, a legal letter can be a first line of defense. But evidence had a patient way of becoming visible. A week after the welfare check, a medical team would document findings. Bank statements would later be examined for spending that suggested priorities that did not align with the child's care. Audio recordings, not yet secured, would become a contested item down the line. At this moment, however, the battle was still about the small, visible things. A broom on cold pavement, a drawing that said, "I'm scared," a photograph taken by a woman who had once cooked for the family. At midday, the driver arrived at the school again. He presented a document authorizing the pickup. This time, the staff asked for a signature. The driver's hands were steady. The paper was in order. Sofia walked out of the classroom with the composed smallness of a child who has learned to contain her movements. Marina watched as the vehicle pulled away, and she catalogued the absence of the child's laughter in the room. It felt like a small theft. That afternoon, Marina filed an internal memo and added a note to the school's copy of the council tutela report. Request immediate follow-up and emergency contact with Rodrigo Almeida. She left a line for the lawyer's office. She asked Dr. Henrique to push for a swift medical evaluation. She called Leonardo to ask him to hold off on any public pieces until the medical report could be obtained and redactions agreed upon. The week that followed was a tangle of polite officialdom and quiet urgency. Investigators did their rounds. Officials from the Child Protection Agency inspected records. The school put into motion every safety protocol it had. Donna Marta came to give another statement and to point to a shelf where small household items had been kept, details that investigators logged as part of the daily life they were reconstructing. Each new entry into the file increased the pressure on the household. Pressure often invites a counter-move. Patrícia did not respond with overt anger. She responded with a strategy of obfuscation and control. She announced small schedule changes. She limited access to the child. She made sure that those in her social circle who mattered knew the official line. The family was being unfairly targeted, their privacy violated, their reputation at stake. Patricia's statements were crafted to paint the school and the agency as intruders. Reputation management had a way of reframing the narrative. The wealthy household had everything to lose by scandal, and in their calculations, removing a child from public view could be protection. Marina felt the moral calculus at the center of her work shift. The choice to fight for a child's safety had costs, to staff, to the school, to the witnesses, to the child herself. Yet Marina could not ignore the drawing folded into the trash, the photograph in plastic, the memory of seeing a small broom scraping frost on an affluent street. She was not acting on impulse, she was acting on accumulation. The files were growing heavy. On a late afternoon, a message arrived that would ratchet the tension higher. Sofia's name had been removed from the school's roster. The official note read that the family had transferred her to a private tutor for the duration of the term. The line was bureaucratic, but its effect was immediate. The child had been isolated from the group that had been watching and keeping records. Privacy cloaked control. Marina sat with the files and breathed. She understood that to prevent harm, those who could act had to keep acting. The school alerted council tutelar. The social worker wrote to Dr. Henrique requesting emergency measures. Leonardo, the journalist, kept a steady presence at the edge of events, asking to be informed but careful not to act in ways that might endanger legal processes or the child. Donna Marta remained available when investigators called. She offered another recollection about a time when a meal was withheld as a measure of obedience, a memory that would later be a line in an affidavit, but that for now held the quiet grief of the witness. Late that evening, Marina walked past the gate where, weeks ago, she had found Sofia with a broom in her hands. The moon had a thin crescent over the mansion's roofline. The pavement was empty. The breeze slid through the citrus trees and carried with it a scent that could have been perfume, or could have been the residue of a world that had decided for now to shelter itself from scrutiny. Marina placed her palm against the iron and thought of a child sweeping in the cold. She turned and went home, knowing that the following days would require a patient accumulation of facts. She knew, too, that patience in this case was not the same as delay. It was a readiness to take the next proper step when the file was ready, and the child's protection could be maximized. The record began to fill in ways that made later legal claims stronger. A fingerprint of small, precise evidence. A medical appointment was scheduled. Council tutelar prepared an interim report. A lawyer drafted a petition for temporary protective measures. Each action required documentation, signatures, chain of custody for exhibits. The small photograph from Donna Marta would be logged, the drawing would be scanned and date-stamped, the teacher's notes would be sworn statements. And yet, for every box checked, resistance was being prepared on the other side. Patrícia consulted counsel that advised caution, recommended quiet compliance while preparing a defensive strategy, and sought to control the optics. It was a chess game in which the stakes were a child's daily life. One afternoon, as Marina sat in her office poring over files, her phone rang. It was a number she recognized as belonging to an investigator at the police station. They were arranging the logistics for the medical assessment. "Bring the records," the officer said. "Bring everything you have." Marina inhaled and felt the thrum of responsibility settle the way it does just before action. She gathered the drawings, the attendance logs, the photograph, the teacher's statements, and the notes from Donna Marta. She put them into a folder and locked the cupboard until the morning. Whatever came next would require courage in small doses, the courage to document, to testify, to maintain respect for a child who had every right to privacy and safety. It would require the community to keep its eye on the child rather than on the drama of wealth. It would require the father, the absent patriarch, to listen when he returned. It would require that adults, teachers, social workers, a weary former housekeeper, a lawyer willing to work pro bono, a journalist mindful of harm, take forms of risk. When Marina closed the school that night, she remembered the subtle things that children carry with them: a favorite pencil, a story told in whispers, a small card made at a table. She thought of how small gestures could matter in ways that legal briefs could not measure. She thought of simple acts: offering a sandwich, sitting beside a child at recess, leaving a note that said, "You are safe." She thought of the many ways adults could show a child that she was seen. If you're watching from somewhere right now and believe children must be protected, comment where you're watching from and like this video. Outside, the mansion's lighted windows glowed like watchful eyes. Inside, the household continued its routines. Outside of it, in rooms lit by fluorescent bulbs and in offices smelling of coffee and paper, people prepared documents and plans that could change the child's life. Evidence was being gathered. Official actions were being set in motion. The case was moving from observation into procedure. The next morning, before the school bell, Marina received a message from Dr. Henrique. The medical examination had been scheduled for the following day, and counsel tutelar had requested authorization to speak with the child alone, if necessary. The legal language felt technical, but it carried a human weight. The paperwork that adults completed could, in the end, deliver a child from a life where tiny tasks in the cold were mistaken for discipline. That afternoon, a small envelope arrived at Marina's desk. Inside was another drawing, more careful than the first. This one folded in a way that suggested a child had wanted to hide it. When Marina unfolded it, she found a paper crowded with crayon lines. A figure in the corner clutched a small broom. Across the top, in block letters, someone had written without flourish and with a directness that made the heart clench, "I wait until he arrives." Marina put the drawing into a plastic sleeve, dated it, and added it to the file. The phrase threaded itself through everything. The broom, the photograph, the attendance slips. It suggested a rhythm imposed on a child's day by adult presence and adult appetite for control. She sat at her desk and, for the first time, allowed herself a moment of anger, not loud or theatrical, but a quiet, steady indignation that human beings sometimes feel when they see a child treated as an object. That indignation fueled a resolve. The next steps were clear: a medical exam with documentation, additional witness statements, legal petitions if needed. But between clarity and action were other things: the family's counter-moves, the possibility of threatened litigation, the vulnerability of witnesses. As she gathered her belongings to leave, Marina thought of the girl with cold feet and a broom. She thought of how, when people choose to look deeper, they may find a net of small cruelties rather than a single sin. She thought of how evidence is rarely dramatic in itself. It is ordinary and therefore difficult to disregard. She thought of the way a drawing can become a legal instrument when adults give it weight. Marina locked the office, placed the folder with the new drawing into a safe, and walked toward the gate. The street was familiar, but that day it carried a different resonance. The mansion loomed, its windows reflecting the city. Marina paused at the corner and for a moment allowed herself a private wish, that the child inside would soon be afforded the space to be simply a child, to play, to eat, to learn, to be warm. The case had moved from a picture on a pavement to a formal file. People who cared were acting, but in the same breath the house's defences were assembling. Patricia's circle was tightening its statements. The family had the means to contest in courts and in public opinion. The road ahead would involve hearings and questions and the weighing of small, steady evidence against strategic defence. For now, however, there was a folder, a scheduled medical exam, and a photograph that would not be erased. It was not the end. It was the first piece of the morning's work, but it felt like a hinge. The child had been seen. The adults who could act had taken the first steps. The next days would decide whether visibility would translate into protection or whether wealth and influence would gaslight the truth into silence. The future of a 7-year-old's daily life depended on the work of people who had decided, against convenience and against risk, to refuse to look away. The medical exam was scheduled for a grey morning 2 weeks after the photograph entered the official file. Counsel tutelar arranged transport, and a trusted social worker sat in the back with Sofia, phone muted, paperwork at the ready. Marina and Dr. Henrique met the team at the pediatric clinic. They brought the stack of records that had become the case's spine, attendance logs, the drawings carrying the words, "I'm scared," and "He comes later," the time-stamped photograph Donna Marta had provided. The pediatric team conducted a full assessment with clinical care and discretion. The nurse measured Sofia's height and weight. The doctor asked gentle questions fitting the child's age. The medical report, later filed as part of the court exhibits, recorded that Sofia showed signs consistent with neglect: underweight for her age, dehydration traces in blood work, and pressure marks on parts of the body consistent with prolonged kneeling or contact with hard surfaces. The report, the medical team testified, also noted behavioral signs, withdrawal during the exam, and a tendency to minimize complaints that are commonly associated with chronic stress in children. Those findings were written into the official record as a clinical assessment. They were not presented as accusations of specific criminal actions, but as medical evidence that corroborated the concerns raised by the school and the witness statements. When Marina left the clinic that afternoon, she felt the same mix of dread and relief people often describe when a silent fear moves toward documentation. The medical report would give the case weight in court. It would also make the stakes clearer for a father who was still largely out of sight. As evidence compiled, so did the strategy. Dr. Henrique convened a small team, a forensic accountant to trace household expenditures, a social worker to interview household staff, and Leonardo to maintain careful, protected contact with the public conversation. The forensic accountant's assignment was precise: follow the money that should have supported a child's basic needs and see if spending patterns matched care. The forensic report, entered into evidence months later and previewed to the defense by discovery, showed a striking asymmetry. According to the accountant, the household spending prioritized luxury items, interior renovations, designer goods, private club memberships, while food expenditure reports included recurring cancelled deliveries and an absence of routine spending on child-specific nutrition or supplements. Household payroll records confirmed that staff shifts were adjusted frequently, and payments to private tutors appeared intermittently, aligning with weeks when Sofia's school attendance dropped. The accountant's interpretation was careful and measured. The records did not prove intentional harm, but they did reveal choices in household priorities that, when combined with other evidence, supported concerns about neglect. Meanwhile, investigators continued to interview household employees. Some remained silent, fearful of losing livelihoods. Others, convinced by Dr. Henrique's assurances of confidentiality and by counsel tutelar's protections, agreed to speak. Donna Marta's testimony was the clearest and most consistent. She described repeated episodes where mealtimes were controlled and where Sofia was made to wait outside the house until some adult decided she could enter. She contributed the photograph she had taken and a short audio file she had saved on her phone, a clip she had recorded months earlier after witnessing a heated exchange between Patrícia and the child. That audio file was a turning point. It captured a quiet domestic command heard in the background, a voice later identified as Patrícia's by household staff saying, "You will not eat until you finish." The phrase was short, blunt, and chilling when heard out of context in a courtroom, and when the recording was submitted to investigators, it was authenticated and logged into evidence. In court, the prosecutor played the clip for the judge and jury. The recording was not sensational. It was a simple, direct piece of the mosaic. Its weight came from its ordinariness, an instruction to a child about food, preserved in a moment when adults were not performing for cameras. Patrícia's defense counsel, Roberto Silva, moved quickly to discredit the material. He argued that the recording could be manipulated, that a staff member's recollection was biased, and that an ex-employee had motives for retaliation. He questioned the chain of custody for the photo and the audio. In hearings over discovery, he sought to exclude material he called unverified. The legal skirmish was predictable. Evidence that undermined a powerful household's reputation was attacked on technical grounds, while witnesses who could corroborate the pattern were painted as unreliable. It was a familiar maneuver in power disputes, one that the prosecution and Dr. Henrique had anticipated. Courtroom preparation became exhaustive. Dr. Henrique prepared Marina to testify, not as an accuser, but as an educator describing observable patterns, the drawings, the attendance records, and her decision to report what she had seen. Marina rehearsed, emphasizing facts and sources, the drawing dated and signed, the photograph provided by Donna Marta, the medical report by the pediatric team, the forensic accountant's analysis. She learned to say calmly and clearly, according to the medical exam, or Donna Marta testified, or the forensic report shows, so that each claim in the narrative pointed to the document that supported it. When the hearing finally took place, the courtroom felt both smaller and louder than Marina had imagined. It was a formal chamber where language mattered and where the weight of documentation found its public voice. The legal hearing pulled the case into a formal register. Sworn testimony, cross-examination, objections and evidentiary rulings. Patrícia sat composed, her posture practiced. Rodrigo, summoned by subpoena, appeared in a jacket that looked slightly out of place for someone who had spent months in transit. He arrived with an assistant, and his arrival pulled a murmur through the gallery. For weeks he had been a name. On that day, he was present to witness the evidence gathered in his absence. Witnesses were called in order of strategic clarity. First, the pediatrician read the findings of the medical exam into the record. Undernourishment markers, pressure marks consistent with prolonged postures, and behavior suggesting chronic stress. The doctor was careful to frame these as clinical observations rather than legal conclusions. A social worker from Council Tutelar presented the agency's assessment and confirmed the procedural steps taken, home visits, staff interviews, and the interim welfare checks that had been executed. Donna Marta took the stand next. Her testimony was unadorned. Under oath, she described what she had seen. The child sent out to sweep on cold mornings, a pattern of delayed access to meals, the photograph she had taken, and the recording she had kept. Her voice was steady. She answered questions succinctly. When lawyers probed at motives, she replied simply that she had been concerned for the child's welfare and had acted on that concern. Her testimony matched the photograph and the recording, forming a triangulation of witness, image, and sound. Marina's testimony traced the arc the school had observed. She described the drawings bearing the phrases "I'm scared" and "he comes later," the downward trend in attendance and grades, the teacher's notes about meals untouched in a child's lunchbox. When asked whether she had taken steps before reporting, she catalogued the attempts to speak with the family and the files compiled for Council Tutelar. Her voice was an educator's voice, precise, measured, resolute. Then the prosecution introduced the forensic accountant's report. On the stand, the accountant explained how household expenditures had been allocated and pointed to discrepancies. Funds that might have provided a consistent nutritional baseline for a child were absent. Certain weeks showed cancelled grocery orders. Expenditures for decorative renovations had surged during a period when the household claimed stability. The accountant did not say these data proved intentional withholding, only that they added context to the other evidence. In a case built on pattern rather than single acts, the accountant's testimony made the financial choices visible. Cross-examination sought to unravel that pattern. Roberto Silva questioned each witness with the aim of creating reasonable doubt. Was the photograph genuine? Could the recording have been edited? Did the medical condition stem from other causes? He argued that absence of evidence for a particular criminal act was not proof of guilt, and he urged the court to be cautious in drawing inferences. As the hearing proceeded, something shifted in the courtroom. Rodrigo, who had remained quiet through much of the testimony, asked permission to address the bench. He rose and spoke to the judge with a voice that betrayed fatigue more than bluster. He said he had trusted the adults who managed his home. He apologized for his physical absence and for the pain the proceedings had revealed. He did not admit to knowledge of specific acts, but acknowledged that the evidence required action. In private conversations with his lawyer, recorded by court observers and later recounted in the press, he said he wanted custody returned and vowed to make changes in his travel schedule if the court allowed him supervised custody. That was not a legal admission of guilt. It was the public statement of a father confronted with a dossier he had not previously reviewed. The judge's ruling came after days of hearings and preliminary motions, and was narrow in its language but decisive in its effect. The court issued provisional protective measures. Patrícia was ordered to have no direct contact with Sofia, a restriction entered into the record and enforced by a temporary restraining order. The judge referred the matter to the criminal prosecutor for further investigation, meaning the actions and statements documented in the hearing would be examined for potential criminal charges. Custody was returned to Rodrigo under court supervision, with specific conditions, mandatory parenting evaluations, supervised visitation schedules, and requirements to participate in family support services while the criminal investigation proceeded. The judge's written order emphasized the need for the child's safety and for a monitored process that would not expose Sofia to further risk. In legal terms, it was neither a full vindication nor a final condemnation. It was an interim set of measures designed to prioritize the child's welfare, while the criminal investigation and possible prosecution unfolded. The judge's decision also authorized immediate protective custody arrangements. Counsel Tutela, working with Donna Rosangela, the shelter coordinator with a long record of caring for children in crisis, arranged a temporary placement for Sofia. The shelter was not a melodramatic refuge. It was a small, secure house where children received therapy, educational continuity, and daily care, while formal proceedings continued. When social workers escorted Sofia from the mansion under court order, the scene was quiet and careful. Patrícia, prohibited from contact, watched from a distance under the enforcement of the restraining order. Her legal counsel filed motions contesting aspects of the ruling, but for the moment, physical separation had been achieved. Marina accompanied Sofia to the shelter and sat with her as the child met the team that would provide immediate support. The shelter staff, led by Donna Rosangela, had experience in reintroducing routine and offering the small, tangible acts of care that tether a child back to ordinary life. A warm meal at a predictable hour, a bed with clean sheets, a nurse who could explain the medical follow-up. Sofia moved through these steps with a cautious, guarded openness. She accepted a hot meal that she ate slowly, then returned to a corner where she drew on paper provided by the shelter's art therapist. The drawings that emerged in the shelter were different. They were less heavy with fear and more scattered with small, hopeful elements. A sun in the corner that the child tentatively colored in yellow, a figure with a smile that was still tentative but present. The art therapist documented progress in ways that were not linear but that mattered. Sofia had narrated a story in which a bird found food and sang, a subtle metaphor of nourishment and voice. Marina watched from the doorway as Sofia gave the therapist a small, folded card she had made at the shelter. Inside were uneven scrawls of crayon, no name, just a heart. Marina, who had once found a child sweeping in the cold, felt the weight of that heart like confirmation that small acts of care could matter beyond legal instruments. The father's role evolved in the weeks after the ruling. Rodrigo, confronted with court-ordered oversight, reduced his travel and submitted to the mandatory evaluations. He attended scheduled sessions with a family therapist and agreed to supervise parenting classes as required by the court. Those actions had to be credible to the judge, to the prosecutor, and to the social workers overseeing the case. It was neither a public absolution nor an end to suspicion. It was a legal path to regain the child's trust under conditions designed to prevent further harm. The criminal referral proceeded in parallel. Prosecutors reviewed the medical findings, the authenticated recording, the photograph, and the witness statements. They interviewed household staff and considered whether specific acts amounted to criminal neglect or abuse under applicable statutes. The process was methodical and slow, as criminal investigations must be. Patricia's legal team mounted defenses, requesting the exclusion of evidence and challenging witness credibility. The public watched snippets of the proceedings with interest, but the legal machinery ground on in quieter rooms, interviews, subpoenas, forensic analyses. Throughout this period, Marina continued to be a steady presence in Sofia's life, though always mindful of boundaries. The school arranged for the child's records to transfer to the shelter's assigned tutor so that educational disruption would be minimized. Marina visited with permission from the shelter and the court, bringing a notebook of old assignments and small items that might comfort a child who had been asked to be small. Her role was not heroic in an exultant sense. It was a practical, consistent one, showing up to translate the world from adult legalities into predictable kindness. The public reaction to the case, amplified by Leonardo's responsible reporting that maintained the child's privacy, spurred conversation about child protection in affluent households. Leonardo's article described institutional challenges without sensational headlines. It emphasized the role of school vigilance, council tutel's mandate, the medical team's clinical notes, and the legal boundaries that govern protection. The piece invited readers to consider how social status can complicate response systems, but it avoided naming or shaming outside of the court's record. The coverage led to an uptick in calls to child protection hotlines in the city, as other educators and neighbors felt empowered to report concerns they had previously dismissed. Legal outcomes take time, and the case moved into a longer phase of hearings and evidentiary battles. Yet there were quieter human developments that signaled movement toward healing. At the shelter, Sofia began a rhythm of therapy sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Therapy focused on re-establishing trust, building a language for feelings, and restoring a sense of agency. In time, the sessions yielded small breaks in the child's shell, a voluntary hug for a staff member after a hard day, a willingness to eat without watching the door. Rodrigo's involvement deepened beyond court mandates. He met with the shelter staff to understand what practical changes could support his daughter: a less demanding travel schedule, a household manager accountable to outside supervision, and a commitment to the court's parenting program. In interviews with his legal counsel, he acknowledged that his prior distance had allowed dynamics in the home to go unexamined. Those acknowledgments were not miraculous confessions. They were the beginning of adjustments he would need to prove over time. Patricia's legal difficulties continued. The restraining order constrained her contact, and the criminal inquiry broadened the exposure of the household's internal decisions. Her public defenses continued, claims of misinterpretation, assertions of parental prerogative. But the court's interim measures remained in place. Reputation management could not immediately undo the documented items now lodged in official files. As months passed, the case's impact radiated outward in concrete ways. The school where Marina worked revised its protocols for identifying and documenting concerns, implementing mandatory staff training and a clearer chain of reporting to council tutelar. Council tutelar itself published anonymized lessons from the case for other institutions, emphasizing the role of cumulative documentation and cross-disciplinary cooperation. Community organizations held forums on child protection in private households, and more parents and caregivers came forward with concerns that had previously gone unreported. The case, in short, prompted system-level reflections without claiming a single, universal solution. Sofia's reunification with her father was gradual and closely monitored. Under the court's supervision, limited, structured visits took place at first in the presence of a social worker and a therapist. Those meetings were small and focused on familiar routines, reading a story, sharing a snack. Rodrigo practiced simple acts, asking what book she preferred, listening when she answered, showing a willingness to follow the guidelines set by the therapist. Progress was not linear. There were days when Sofia withdrew and days when she offered a smile. The court evaluated each step, basing decisions on the child's best interests and on behavioral markers over time. After a period of supervised contact and demonstrable compliance with court-ordered conditions, a judge allowed expanded custody under continued supervision, conditional on Rodrigo's adherence to parenting programs and on ongoing therapy for Sofia. The order emphasized that any future contact by Patrícia would be subject to legal prohibition unless the criminal process changed that status. The formal language was careful. It recognized that legal oversight was a temporary scaffolding for a fragile process of rebuilding trust. The end of formal hearings did not equal an end to recovery. The months after the ruling were shaped by therapy sessions, school reintegration plans, and administrative follow-ups. Marina worked with Sofia's tutor and with the school to reintroduce her to peer groups, to create spaces where the child could exercise normal childhood rhythms, hand-holding social games, art classes, a soccer practice that let her run. Sofia's art, once dominated by thin figures and gates, gradually filled with playgrounds and animals and a sun drawn with confidence. One small object captured the slow arc with particular tenderness. Several months into supervised reunification, Marina received a package on a rainy afternoon at the school. Inside was a folded piece of construction paper sealed with childlike scrawl. The envelope bore no return address. A post-it attached by the shelter staff explained that Sofia had asked the therapist to send a note to the woman who watched me and did not let it be forgotten. Marina unfolded the paper with hands that trembled slightly and found a bright, uneven drawing of a small figure standing beside a larger one, both smiling. Across the bottom, in letters still a little shaky, were 3 words: "Thank you, Marina." It was the coda that many in the case had been waiting for, not a legal victory, but a human acknowledgement that the child had found an adult she trusted. Marina placed the card in the folder where the case file now included the drawings that had once announced fear. It was both evidence and artifact of care. The public narrative ended in many ways with a mixture of institutional reflection and personal restoration. Council Tutelar issued a statement about the importance of cross-sector vigilance. The school continued to train staff. Rodrigo remained under court-supervised conditions while rebuilding daily life with his daughter. Patrícia faced the ongoing legal inquiry and the reputational consequences it carried. The court's restraining measures remained active as part of a process that could extend into criminal prosecution depending on further findings. For the professionals involved, the case was a reminder of how small acts, observing a child, preserving a drawing, making one phone call, accumulate into the kind of documentation that can prompt institutional action. For Marina, the experience reshaped her teaching life. She organized a small seminar for teachers about observation and documentation, and received quiet thanks from colleagues who had once hesitated to act. The shelter's role, and particularly Donna Rosangela's steady leadership, showed the practical contours of recovery. Predictable meals, skilled therapy, and adults who would teach a child to expect reliable care. For Sofia, months of therapy and the presence of supportive adults yielded something simple and profound: the reconstitution of a childhood that allowed a smile to become lasting rather than fleeting. The case also left open questions without tidy endings. Legal processes can be slow. Systemic change is incremental. Some staff who had testified continued to work, but under the shadow of retaliation fears. Monies spent on legal defense underscored how wealth can shape access to resources in ways that complicate accountability. Those were not solvable in a single verdict. They were challenges the institutions involved began to address in policy and training. In the quiet aftermath, Marina sat in her office and looked at a small stack of construction paper drawings she kept on a shelf. The earliest were the ones that had begun the case, thin figures by gates. Then came the shelter drawings with the brave sons. Finally, a small card with 3 gratitude words lay on top. Marina thought of the morning she had first seen Sofia sweeping on cold pavement, and of the many ordinary people who had chosen to act. A nurse documenting findings, a former housekeeper preserving a photograph, a forensic accountant tracing patterns, a journalist who amplified concerns without exposing a child, a lawyer who took the case pro bono, and social workers who built a safety net. The case did not become an emblem of perfect justice. It did, however, become a record of what can happen when institutions and ordinary citizens do the hard work of accumulation, documentation, and care. Sofia's path forward would not be simple. Recovery, the therapists emphasized, is measured in days, in routines, and in repeated kindness. But she had a chance, a measurable, protected chance, because people had done the small, necessary things to make evidence visible and to insist on protection. On a bright afternoon, months after the initial photograph had made the case visible, Marina received a brief email from Rodrigo's legal team, acknowledging the measures they were under and confirming steps taken to comply with court orders. It was formal, but it also spoke to a private reality. The father, once distant, had become present in ways that mattered. The final public court order, the administrative document summarizing interim protections and the criminal referral, remained on file. Patricia's ability to contact Sofia stayed legally restricted, pending further investigation. The court's focus, throughout its orders, remained clear: prioritize the child's immediate safety while preserving the integrity of investigative and judicial processes. As the city moved on, the school adjusted its rhythms. Teachers continued to teach, children continued to play. Marina kept the small stack of drawings where she could see them, a reminder that vigilance need not be dramatic to be effective. The handmade card from Sofia sat on her desk as a bookmark, a quiet testament that in the face of power, small acts of care can change the trajectory of a child's life. If this story moved you, subscribe and learn how local child protection agencies work. Link in the description.